Hello everyone, I'm Aditya Prajapati, a final year PhD candidate in Materials and Systems Engineering Lab at the University of Illinois at Chicago, working with Dr. Meena Singh. Welcome to my presentation titled Design of a Fully Integrated Artificial Photosynthetic System for a Moisture Gradient CO2 Capture and Reduction. So here's how I'll outline my talk. I'll first introduce artificial photosynthesis, then explain our motivation and objectives. We'll briefly go over what moisture gradient CO2 capture system is. Then I'll explain the computational methods used for this work, and we'll go over the results and the scope of the future work of this project. So CO2 is a threat to an environment, is one of the most prevalent greenhouse gases, and anthropogenic CO2 coming from coal-fired power plants, automobiles, and industries, they are the major sources. And that's why there is a need to develop sustainable methods to remove this excess CO2 from atmosphere. And a great alternative is to use electrochemical routes. Now, artificial photosynthesis is one of the electrochemical processes inspired from natural photosynthesis. So let's look at the comparison between natural and artificial photosynthetic processes. So both have a light absorber. In plants, it's chlorophyll, and in the artificial photosynthetic device, the cell, it's the solar panel, or it's called the light absorber. Then CO2 is captured using stomata. Here, CO2 is fed from the air to the electrochemical cell here, and as a byproduct of this CO2 reduction happening both in leaf and in artificial photosynthetic cell, we get oxygen evolution. So these are the sort of common things that we have between natural and artificial photosynthetic systems. Now let's move on to discuss different types of AP systems, or artificial photosynthetic systems. So mainly there are two types. The first one is the integrated cascade system. Here we can see that we have one electrochemical cell, and we have one CO2 capture unit. So one reduction unit, one capture unit. So here what is happening is the CO2 is getting captured first, then it goes to the electrochemical cell to get reduced, and then it's separated, recycled. So what is happening here is that there is an additional energy that is required for recycling the CO2, compression to pump the CO2 to and from the CO2 reduction unit, and to the CO2 capture unit, and from the capture unit. So those are additional energy requirements. Whereas the other type of system is the fully integrated system, where there is no additional energy requirements as imposed in the integrated cascade system, and what we see is one pass CO2 capture and conversion. So based on what information we have right now, we decided to set our objectives for this project. We need to develop a sustainable CO2 capture technique, need to develop a high flux CO2 capture system for a fully integrated AP system, and we need to see how this integration works for CO2 capture and reduction. So our objectives for this work are designing a moisture gradient CO2 capture system to see how it works in different operating conditions, and designing a fully integrated AP system with moisture gradient CO2 capture and its reduction to carbon monoxide. So let's see what moisture gradient CO2 capture exactly is. So here's a nice schematic that would explain everything. So we have a dry side of the anion exchange membrane and a wet side. On a dry side, CO2 is captured by the hydroxyls and the carbonates of the membrane with this reaction, and it converts to bicarbonates. So bicarbonates are the ones that are actually getting transported to the other side, the wet side of the membrane. And we can see that since there is a gradient of moisture, there is less moisture on the dry side and more, of course, because it's all electrolyte, there's more water there. Water likes to move towards the dry side. Once that gradient is set up, bicarbonate moves towards the wet side. Once it comes in touch with the wet side, which is full of water, electrolyte, it starts going back, the reaction at the dry interface flips, and the bicarbonates generate CO2 and carbonates. That's how the CO2 is released into the wet side of the system. So now let's move on to how we actually computationally establish this. So we chose to work with a one-dimensional model using COMSOL, with half of it being electrolyte and the other half being the membrane. So the water from the electrolyte, of course, establishes the gradient from the electrolyte to the membrane, and we have a CO2 dry feed coming in at low relative humidity, or low RH. So these are the equations we use to solve. These are basically Nernst-Planck equations and electroneutrality and the flux equations that we use to solve. So the reactions RJ over here are these reactions. That is just the water dissociation reversible reaction, CO2 with hydroxyls going to bicarbonates, and CO2 with carbonates and water going to bicarbonates. So the species here considered are CO2, K plus is just the spectator ion from the potassium bicarbonate and potassium carbonate that's used in the electrolyte. And we have H plus, OH minus, carbonates and bicarbonates. So now let's move on to the actual results that we obtained from this work. So first, let's look at actual concentration profiles to see what to expect from this kind of simulation. How are the species behaving inside of the membrane? So here we have concentration profiles of water, carbon dioxide, bicarbonates, and carbonates. So the physics of this membrane were simulated at varying current densities of 100 microns, or 0.1 millimeter thick anion exchange membrane. And the background charge, or the resin anion exchange membrane concentration, was taken to be 1 molar. We considered a well-mixed electrolyte, so the species, as soon as they go into the electrolyte, they diffuse very fast. And on the wet side and on the dry side, we had some dehumidified feed coming in. The concentration profiles, as we can see, for water, there is a steep gradient here coming from, so 12.5 molar is corresponding to 100% relative humidity. That's what we set up as our boundary condition. And this is basically the relative humidity here is what we actually set for our simulation to study the effect. And we can see that there is going to be a gradient across the membrane. For bicarbonates, it's the same, so it's diffusing in from the dry side because the CO2 is getting converted to bicarbonates, and it's going into the wet side. Same thing here, CO2. So CO2, there's no concentration of CO2 here because all of it is getting converted to bicarbonates. That's why the model shows that there is very low concentration here, and as we go to the wet side, as we move towards it, we are getting evolution of CO2 in the system. Similar behavior for the bicarbonates. So these profiles generally agree with the mechanism that we just explained. So now let's see what are the effect of different concentration, different operating conditions for these, for this membrane. So let's look at the effect of current density. Now, how the current density was set up in the membrane was, in this model, was in the electrolyte. We just used a flux to remove the CO2 at a certain rate. In real world application, it would be like when it's integrated with an electrocatalyst, which is consuming CO2 at that rate. So just to make the model think like we are actually consuming the CO2, we use the parameter current density. And as we can see here, as the current density increases, the concentration of CO2 in the electrolyte decreases. When there is zero current, that means there's no CO2 getting consumed. We get a maximum CO2 concentration of about 33 millimolar, which is when CO2 is saturated in an aqueous system, according to Henry's law, and that's the maximum concentration it can get. And the time here, 1,000 seconds, is just so that we run the system to steady state, and that's when we stop seeing any change in concentration profiles. So, and then we move to the effect of membrane width. So the thicker the membrane, as we can see here, the purple curve here, the thicker the membrane, the worse it performs for a given given current density. So as we have thinner and thinner membrane, we have lesser resistance to the transport, and the CO2 is getting captured very fast. And that's why we are getting higher concentration of CO2 in the electrolyte. And as the membrane width increases, we are getting lower and lower concentration. So the effect of resin concentration. This is an inherent property of a membrane. So a membrane has a certain ion exchange capacity, and it would vary depending on membrane to membrane. So we varied the background concentration of resin, or background concentration of the membrane, from 1 molar to 1.6 molar, and we can see here that at a given operating current density, we are observing a drop in CO2 capture performance when resin concentration decreases. Highest is at 1.6 molar. That's the scope of what we have varied, and lowest is at 1 molar. Now, the effect of relative humidity. Now, this is an interesting effect to study because the entire premise of our work is moisture gradient. So here we can see that we have, as the relative humidity decreases, we are getting a steeper gradient of water and more CO2 capture. So we need to evaluate these membranes in a certain way. So we established certain metrics so that we can evaluate the membranes. The one metric that we have is CO2 capture efficiency, which is the flux of CO2 removal in the electrolyte over the flux of bicarbonate ion in the membrane, because bicarbonates are doing the heavy lifting here. So the other one is CO2 separation efficiency, which is pretty simple. Concentration of CO2 in the electrolyte over the maximum possible concentration of CO2, which is 33 millimolar. And we get a curve when we plot, we get a diode-like curve like this. And here we see ideal case would be, we would need the maximum possible area, like a rectangular curve. And the higher area implies higher capability of retaining maximum capture efficiency for a wider range of separation efficiency. So here we evaluated the performance curves of different operating parameters: membrane width, resin concentration, and effect of relative humidity. And as intuitively observed, intuitively it's clear that we have this lower the membrane, better the performance curve; higher the concentration of resin, better the performance curve. Ideally it should be rectangular, but the membrane performs better with lower thickness because there's less mass transfer resistance. Higher resin concentration because it increases the availability of CO2 capture sites, and steeper moisture gradient, so lower RH. So we did set up a simulation for moisture gradient CO2. We realized that a fully integrated system is better, and that's why we used that for our simulation. A conceptual design of moisture gradient CO2 was developed, and it was evaluated at different operating conditions. So the future scope of this work, what an interesting study would be to use more realistic model for moisture gradient here by using more water-dependent kinetics and using the diffusion of the species being as a function of the concentration of water or water uptake in the membrane. And then the integration with the electrochemical cell would be the next step, which could be like, if this is a fully integrated system, we could again model this in COMSOL to see how this performs. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Minesh Singh, and my lab members at Materials and Systems Engineering Lab. And thank you all for making it to the end of the video. I have the link to the rest of my videos, presentations for this conference in the description below. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.